If you're Zelensky sitting in that meeting and you're just going, what are you doing? Oh, it was just so bad. All of it was so bad. I just don't even know if
It
you.
did reassure me, though, on one level, Stephen, and that is that if Australia ever does face a serious military threat, I'm confident that America will come to our assistance. It'll just cost us half of our iron ore.
Welcome to this week's episode of Socially Democratic. This election, both campaigns are now busy framing one another. While Dutton tries to paint Albanese as an ineffectual softie, Albanese tries to paint Dutton as Trump light. Which message do we think will prevail? Well, stay tuned to find out. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well, and you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month, and you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift, so if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. So for empathetic and expert legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on a Tuesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. It is the 25th of March. The month is almost up at its conclusion. April is just around the corner. That means daylight savings is about to end. Winter is coming. And that means it's also time for our monthly edition of the Feeney Files, Fianna Fáil. And joining me, I'm still hungover from St. Patrick's Day, I think. Joining me on the line is former Senator, former member for Batman, former campaign director for Victorian Labor and National Assistant Secretary, and the 1991 Mercedes College Dungeons and Dragons champion, David Feeney. Welcome back. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Yeah, more like the mid-'80s, I'm afraid, but thank you for deducting a few years there from me.
I did stuff that up. My math was wrong there, but the sport was right.
That's it.
Okay. We've got a lot to get through, so no chit chat at the start. I was going to ask you how your St. Patrick's Day was, but maybe we can talk about that at the end. But happy St. Patrick's Day to you, David.
Yeah, and you.
Lots of polls have come out this month. 12 polls have actually come out this month, published polls, compared to the previous month. So as you know, there's an election coming when there's more polling being done. I feel for the people living in marginal seats because their phones are probably ringing off the hook. But what we are seeing from these polls is out of these 12, Labor is leading on a two-party preferred in 6 of them. Compare that to the month before, Labor was only leading in 1 of them, and it was Roy Morgan. Good old Roy.
Yeah.
But
Labor's won every election according to Roy Morgan since 1975.
I know. I was reflecting on that before the show as well. Like Roy Morgan is like when I was a little kid, I used to dream up and imagine scenarios upon which the Australian national football team would win the World Cup, in which would beat Brazil in the semi-finals 3-0, and then mollocate Germany 5-0 in the final. Like it's just fantasy. And that's what Roy Morgan is to election polling. I just think he sits there and goes, what number will I give Labor in this particular one? I'll give him a 58. See how we go. See how we feel. Feeling good about it,
If you're a depressed campaign director, Roy Morgan's always uplifting because Labor always wins.
Yeah. So in the ones that I guess matter that have come out, the news poll one has Labor down 51.49, but we're up in YouGov 51.49, down in Freshwater 51.49, and then the YouGov one, which has just recently come out, is 50-50. Essential is also, they don't do two-party preferred. They've got us on 47, 47. But broadly speaking, what we are seeing is a trend that is both an uptick in Labor's two-party preferred and an uptick in Labor's primary vote, and a downward trend in the Liberal Party's primary vote. I know these are trends, David, but should we be getting excited about these trends? These arrows, these lines are heading in the right direction, but I don't want to get too carried away. But what are your initial thoughts on this month of research?
Yeah, well, I think it's certainly green shoots. It's good news. As reluctant as I am to concede that there's something good happening, there's something good happening here,
Good.
Stephen. And I think we can feel it in our bones as well. And I think there's a few different factors going on. For those who regularly listen to the Feeney Files, you'll note that we have been absolutely correct in our prediction about the election timing. And consistent with that is the fact that certainly the government, and also I think to a lesser extent the coalition, have really calibrated their story arcs to this period and this season. And Labor has been working hard to get to this moment where it's going to launch the budget and use that as a platform from which to launch its campaign for re-election. And so that, I think, has seen consequently a tightening in the messaging and the presentation, and that's delivering fruit. I think there's a few other things going on too. I think the kind of national and international currents were working for the Conservatives up until recently. So the election of Trump, the kind of war on woke, DEI, all of the various other attributes of the kind of Trump-sponsored rise of conservatism around the world kind of have reached a crescendo and now have gone kind of a little wild and woolly in places, particularly if you're Canadian or live in Greenland. And there's obviously been the tariffs, and Trump has now become not simply a disruptor of US politics, but a disruptor potentially of all of our lives and all of the systems upon which we rely. And so I think that kind of broad gestalt, which was favouring Conservatives and putting a spring in their step, has, that tide is now coming back in quite swiftly. And so the sort of national and international mood is not working for them as it did only a few weeks ago. So, as people look at Trump and tariffs and deteriorating security and, his treatment of Ukraine and Zelensky and yada, 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 and they recoil from that, or at least many, if not most, recoil from that, do they then think to themselves, well, Dutton's the guy to navigate the future for our country? And I think it just put a question mark over Dutton at a moment of exquisite timing for the government. As we've discussed on many occasions, externalities have been an enormous part of the life of this government. Things flashing in from outer space and transforming the narrative. The war in Gaza, the Trump election, the war in Ukraine. And this is another one, but in contrast to the others, this one's working for the government. This one's creating a conversation that leads more people rather than less people to the answer is Labor. So green shoots, and I think the polling is encouraging. And as I said, and I've repeated many times, you call an election when you think you can win one, and the government really has held its fire so it can launch now in a season when it thinks it has the best chances of winning.
That point about Trump is really interesting, David, because, and I'm not sure if we've spoken about it, but I know I've certainly spoken to folks about what had happened in, say, the last month or so. We saw a lot of right-wing, centre-right leaders around the world, historically, in maybe the last 6 months, kind of tangentially associate themselves with either Donald Trump or the politics of Donald Trump or the policies of Donald Trump. And then in this section of the year, in the last couple of months, slowly kind of just sort of, move away from him in a very subtle way. And I'm talking about the prime minister in Italy, the new chancellor in Germany, even the president in Mexico, the opposition leader in Canada, who was sailing in the polls there for a while, and then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, oh no, I really regret that. I need to turn that around, right?" And maybe
turns out that Trump guy's about to cross the border with a few armored divisions, and hanging around with him ain't as good as it used to be.
yeah, exactly. And so Mr. Dutton is obviously, I wonder if Mr. Dutton is actually starting to think, wonder if I may have overcooked this one a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite as dramatic as that, because we have seen, and this is a good example, I think, of where what plays well with conservatives in the United States doesn't play so well internationally. And Zelensky in Ukraine is a good example of this. After the treatment of Zelensky at the White House, where Zelensky was kind of bullied and manhandled and thrown out and told that if he didn't hand over his resources, all help would stop, I was fascinated to see conservative commentators in the United States and sort of Trump cheer squads in other places come out and say that was great. It was Trump, being Trump and being strong and looking out for American interests, and Zelensky completely mishandled the meeting, and they sort of had a reaction to that event, which was just in complete contrast. Well, not simply to my own, I was appalled, but to a lot of conservatives outside of the United States. So we saw, for instance, the United Kingdom, there was a bit of a unity ticket between the Labor government and the Conservatives in being, and Farage for that matter, and Reform. All of them came out in support of Zelensky. All of them kind of recoiled in the same instinctive way that I think Australians did on both sides of the aisle. So we saw, obviously, the Labor government recoil in horror at the treatment of Zelensky, but so too did Conservatives in Australia. And we saw, if you suffer the Australian newspaper as I do, it's one of the few I read every day, Conservative commentators in the Australian were appalled and denounced it. And this is true. I mean, you mentioned Germany. I mean, after their Trump administration's dalliance with the AfD, the German chancellors, got it in for the Yanks in a big way. It wasn't a great stretch for him to change his talking points. But so, yes, I think your point's right, but I don't think Dutton has overcooked it, but the winds have changed. And you're not riding in Trump's slipstream anymore. You're trying to, you are, I think most Liberals were genuinely appalled. And the flag just isn't looking as bright as it did only a few short weeks ago. And as you say, in Canada, it's a transformation. And the Conservative leader has gone from measuring the draperies in the Prime Minister's office to scrambling because of this lunatic policy the government, the administration has adopted with respect to Canada and annexing it. And he hasn't stopped talking about it. I mean, it wasn't just a lunatic thought bubble at Mar-a-Lago. He said it again and again and again and again. And the Canadians are out of their minds. I mean, they're furious. Yeah. It's bananas.
Did you see the Liberal Party, the Canadian Liberal Party ad with the new Prime Minister and new leader of the Liberal Party and the actor Mike Myers at a hockey rink?
No, I didn't.
It's fantastic. Like, it is really, really good. We'll put it. I might put a link in the show notes for folks to have a look at. It's fantastic, actually. And obviously, the election in Canada has been called. And just a note to listeners, we're recording an episode next week with Jack Milroy to do a preview of the Canadian election, and it'll be up. That should be up next Friday for our audience. I just want to get your assessment of a series of recent announcements and positioning by both major parties here in Australia. And it's potentially a useful snapshot of where we think the campaign narrative is heading. Dutton seems to be sort of leaning into this aggressive messaging and disruptive sort of policy proposals, whereas Albanese is focusing on this sort of stability and delivering in areas that Labor is seen as strengths. And I want to start with, just to give some context for our listeners. So the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, used this term limp wristed to criticise the Prime Minister's response to the Chinese naval exercise during a foreign policy event at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. And the comment was made in reference to these live fire drills conducted by Chinese naval ships off the Australian coast in February. Is Dutton going bold in this moment? Like, he sort of leaning into this national security and law enforcement thing, then trying to frame up Labor as being weak and indecisive. But in the end, he sort of had to apologise. But in doing so, it repeated the story. And maybe he kind of enjoyed that. He liked that. What's your take on that?
I don't know whether he did it deliberately or not. I don't think it matters too much. I mean, it's one of these. I mean, people who are going to get offended by his use of that phraseology are probably people on the progressive side of politics in any event. I think you can get a little too puritanical on these things if you don't watch yourself. And, you don't want to be amongst the new Puritans and denounce language which is crude or inappropriate, but also shrugged off by most. So I wouldn't make too much of that. In terms of the foundational policy point, I mean, I feel like the country is standing on this is staring into this abyss, and the abyss is our long-standing reliance on our US alliance with the United States, and our reliance on our great and powerful friend, and the fact that we have relied and continue to rely on the US in almost every facet of our defence and security policy, and confronting the implications of the moment are terrifying. And neither party has really been able to bring itself to do that. What the Liberal Party have said is, essentially what they've said is, Trump's having a bit of a fever at the moment, but the US is our ally. We need to double down and strengthen our alliance with the US and try and shape US opinion, which is all very comforting. And the Labor Party has kind of come out with a kind of another version of that. I think what both sides have had forced upon them is something like a khaki election, thanks to the Chinese flotilla circumnavigating Australia. And I just think it's worth, I feel like the hysteria about the Chinese flotilla is wildly overinflated. A Chinese cruiser and a Chinese destroyer and a Chinese replenishment ship sailing around Australia is not an existential threat to this country. And as they travelled around practicing their long endurance, long distance naval skills, China's got the biggest navy in the world, but it's not that experienced. So they're obviously out there training, trying to gain experience in long distance blue water operations, which is not something the Chinese have ever done. We should reflect on the fact that they were behaving on the high seas in a lawful way, technically speaking, in a lawful way, and in a way that all other navies do too. What made it unusual was how clumsy the Chinese were. When other navies undertake these sorts of voyages, they usually intersperse them with diplomatic visits. They'll visit friendly ports, they'll visit not that friendly ports, but they're not hiding out at sea. They will wave the flag, they'll come in for a port visit and engage in some military diplomacy. And they will give everybody plenty of notice. And of course, the Chinese just circumnavigated Australia without doing any port visits to Australia or anywhere else. And without providing us with the courtesy of proper notice. And so if there was a political mind behind this adventure, I can't imagine what it was thinking, because, of course, it just brought the whole Chinese relationship into Australian domestic politics in a very unattractive way for China. And it raised the spectre of these issues on the eve of an Australian election. So, so what? The coalition then announces $3 billion extra for defence to buy another squadron of F-35s. Can't see immediately how that's in China's interest. Like, what the fuck were they doing? Anyway, I mean, Chinese capacities for home goals are enormous, but it did set the scene, didn't it, for the Australian political, this election and this Australian election, beginning with that kind of khaki overlay and there being more conversation than usual about the defence budget and our defence standing. And I think that's interesting, and it means that we're going to see, I'm sure, in the budget, Labor respond with increased defence spending, because there's now this perceived pressure that our United States ally wants us to spend more on defence, and they're getting very truculent with those who they perceive as not paying their own way. And we've got this, increasing anxiety about China, which China has stupidly stoked by sending, a cruiser and a destroyer around Australia and seeing whether they can make the distance without falling to pieces. So that's where we're at. So I don't think Dutton has overcooked it. I think really the public policy truth is that neither side has yet begun the process of confronting the true implications of this new US behaviour. But that's probably a topic for a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, I know. And actually, I do want to follow up a question about that, thinking it from more of a domestic perspective, particularly through the lens of the electorate. And there are a number of Chinese Australians now that vote in elections here in this country that have made this place their home. A lot of them live in the eastern suburbs of,
I think there are 1 million
Melbourne, and
of Chinese heritage, Australian citizens of Chinese heritage.
Yeah, it's not insignificant. And I actually think part of the reason why, just apart, not the silver bullet, but certainly didn't hinder Labor's chances in Victorian state elections in 2018 and 2022 was the perception by Chinese Australian voters of the relationship that, under the leadership of Daniel Andrews, had forged with China, like going and visiting China and so on and so forth. And that goes down well. And I think that Labor was rewarded with that at the election, where we won a swag of seats all through the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, where there is a lot like Box Hill and a whole bunch of other smaller electorates through there. And I'm just wondering about, if you're Anthony Albanese, and I think Albanese's done some good things in terms of trying to reach to repair the relationship with China compared to what it was like with Morrison. But when you're Anthony Albanese and this flotilla does park itself off the coast of Australia, you'd be like, I don't need that right now. I actually want to have a reasonably good relationship with China, and I want to be able to send that message to Chinese voters in Melbourne and Sydney, particularly because there's a lot of marginal. Chisholm has a large Chinese population. It is a target seat for the Liberal Party. It is a seat that is a battleground seat for us. It's a
there's plenty of them, really.
Yeah, plenty of them, absolutely. Parramatta, you name it, right?
Well, this is why it was such a home goal by the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, if they're trying to influence Australian politics, they were really trying to influence it in a way that wasn't in their interest and was in the interest of the coalition, which is mystifying. I think. Firstly, when talking about the Australians of Chinese heritage, let's remember what a remarkably diverse group they are. Some of them have, been in Australia for as long as any other immigrant group. Some of them have come to Australia from Taiwan. For instance, the Taiwanese community in Queensland is notably large. So we shouldn't rush to the assumption that Australians of Chinese heritage are all fans of communist China, because there's a plethora of views. And indeed, a cursory analysis of Chinese community groups will show you that, for every 10 Chinese, there's 20 community groups. So there's plenty of different and disagreeing opinions inside that community. But of course, one thing that community does believe, like indeed the rest of us, is that war with China is a really bad idea. Yeah. And if we can sensibly avoid it, we obviously should. And so bellicose language about Australia and Western relations with China obviously is particularly confronting for them. That's just a fact of life. I think one of the learnings the Liberal Party took out of its election defeat is it now really tries very painfully to not talk about China, but to talk about the Chinese Communist Party and to distinguish the regime from the population in mainland China. I don't know how effective that I think the effect, how effective that is might be in their imaginations, I think, yeah. rather than on the streets of our towns and cities. I think it's a big issue, and it's a complex one for both sides of politics, because obviously we do have a defence policy that's firmly fixated with the pace of Chinese rearmament. And at the same time, they're our biggest trading partner. Mm. But I really feel, I say this, and a lot of my friends in the defence and strategic community really don't agree with me, but I do feel that the government has struck a successful balance. And hats off here, shout out to our Trade Minister, Don Farrell. He has led a dramatic recovery in our trading relationships with China. And on all of those key commodities where various barriers had been created by the Chinese to frustrate the Morrison government, they've now all come down, and Australian trade is once again booming with China. And that's not the product of us taking some supine foreign affairs position with respect to China. That's just by conducting diplomacy in an adult way and not running around the Australian body politic denouncing China for domestic votes, or what you imagine are domestic votes, and imagining that no one in Beijing's listening. Your various classic moments of the Morrison government, like when they decided that they would denounce China's biolabs in Wuhan before Trump even got the opportunity to. Anyway, all ancient history. I think behaving like a sensible middle power instead of a rogue state has done Australia proud in the last few years. And as I say, it hasn't led to us adopting any kind of supine defence policy or retreating on any of our national interests, or us not stating our objections when we have them, but by behaving like adults and working constructively with Chinese trade. So that's a big tick, and very hard for the coalition to take that away from us, because the smart ones in their ranks know it to be true.
Go Don. There's been a number of announcements that Dutton's made in the last couple of weeks, proposals around the deportation referendum, supermarket divestiture. It sort of signals a willingness to shake things up and speak to voter frustration with institutions and red tape. By that, I mean so Dutton proposed a deportation referendum that would give the government more power to remove non-citizens who commit serious crimes. And there was a supermarket proposal that would allow the ACCC to break up companies engaging in anti-competitive behaviour. We've been waiting for a long, long time for Dutton and the coalition to make some policy announcements heading into this election season. Is Dutton tapping into voter sentiment? Are these smart policies, or do you think he's over-egging it somewhat?
No, I think these are potentially smart policies. No one in the commentariat agrees with me about that, but they're all wrong. I think having a referendum where the government suggested that people with dual citizenship who had who'd committed some kind of treason could not then be deported, that is not a hill Labor wants to die on, because I think out there in the street, the answer from 90% will be, yeah. If you're wandering around Australia committing acts of terrorism or whatever it might be, then you can F off. And it will be a crude debate, and it's obviously got all kinds of dog whistling going on. But the fundamental proposition, I think, will be overwhelmingly supported. And it's just another effort to try and move Labor into a principled position of catastrophe.
Yeah.
With respect to the idea about the ACCC, it'll be interesting to see whether the coalition are serious about this. And it'll be interesting on two levels, Stephen. One of the things about kicking the campaign off with a budget, which, as we've discussed, given the May timing, Labor has to make a virtue out of necessity. It had to do a budget. Is that it means the Liberals have a right of reply on Thursday. And that is a significant opportunity for Dutton to talk policy. He may not avail himself of it. He may choose to hold fire. He may choose to denounce Labor rather than say anything positive, which is, as we know, a pretty standard play from Conservative politicians. But he might put some flesh on these bones. If he does, at that moment or subsequently in the campaign, then it does represent a bold policy step for two reasons. The first being it will be very popular out there in voter land, but very unpopular with the Liberal Party's traditional membership and donor base. And as we've seen swiftly in the United States and more slowly but inexorably here in Australia, we do see this phenomena of high education, high income voters increasingly moving to the left side of the equation, and low education, low income voters increasingly moving to the right of the equation, as though the two parties are almost swapping constituencies. If you compare it with 30 years ago, I don't mean as compared to last year. And this is the kind of policy which would speak to that and accelerate that, because out there in voterland and amongst the Conservatives' rural constituencies, the notion that the Coles Woolworths duopoly is screwing us is just universally understood and agreed. Yeah. But both of those titans of Australian business have enormous constituencies and power, most particularly in the Liberal Party. And so if he's able to defy that in his quest for outer suburban voters, that is a significant thing.
And it seemed to have caught members of his own caucus on the hop, because a lot of them even didn't know about it. The first they read about it was when it was in the media. And I'm just wondering, is that intentional by Dutton? Like, it was like, I'm going to do this. It's, I'm running this show. I'm the person who's going to drag this party over the line to get it back in the government, regardless of what some in my caucus may think about this strategy. Or was it a clumsy execution?
Well, between an F up and a conspiracy, it's an F up every time, is my other golden rule.
Yeah, I know that. And I thought, I wonder how David's going to answer this one, because I think it actually might be intentional, but...
Yeah, I don't think it is. I mean, often firstly, in opposition, leaders, most especially Conservative leaders, have a very wide discretion, because the apparatus of cabinet and government is not constraining them. And they usually rule their roost with a kitchen cabinet, and the kitchen cabinet will know what's going on, and everyone else has no idea what's going on. And everyone else, other than Dutton's kitchen cabinet, would not have known about it as a matter of course, but they would have only have objected to not knowing about it when he does something they disagree with. Otherwise, they just stay mum, as you'd expect. Yeah. So he falls into a pattern of behaviour because they're happy with what he's doing. And then when they're not happy, that pattern of behaviour is what bit them on the proverbial. And of course, the reason some of them would not have been happy is because they're neoliberal economists, and or they're Conservatives who, have a constituency inside the business community, which includes Coles and Woolworths. So, I think people were ignored like they're routinely ignored in the Liberal Party. And on this occasion, they took offence because it affected them, whereas normally they just let it all slide by.
There is an ad that's been out for a while that is a positive ad trying to shape the narrative around Peter Dutton's leadership. It's a Liberal Party ad. We've got a link to it. We're not going to it goes for a minute, so we're not going to play it on the show here, but there is a link in the show notes for you to have a look at it. We also are going to look at an ad in a minute, and we will play that, which is it's almost like a pos negative but it's from the Labor Party, and it's also framing up Peter Dutton. And I want to get your reflections on both of these, David, starting with the positive Liberal Party ad about Peter Dutton. What did you make of it? What are they trying to say to the electorate? How are they trying to frame up Peter Dutton? And does it sort of show to us areas where they're probably in their focus groups that what folks have said about Peter Dutton and they're trying to soften? I wonder. I just want to get your reflections on this first positive ad for the Liberal Party on Dutton's leadership.
Yeah, I think it's a good ad. I was impressed by it. It's a 60-second ad, as you say, and that's typical now of launch ads. And this is clearly what this is for the Liberal Party. It's the ad that's launching their electronic campaign. I mean, it had good production values. It's an easy ad to watch and to listen to. What it's trying to accomplish, as you touched on, is it's trying to take his strengths, his pre-existing strengths, and humanize them. So, for instance, I'm a Queensland cop. Here's why that's a good thing. Then it goes to his small business background, how he's accustomed to taking responsibility for leadership and for running things in a prudent and responsible way. So it's building his credentials as a manager and leader. And I thought it was kind of putting a nice wrap around what we know of him, because obviously, you know, he has readily fallen into being a caricature, the hard man, the guy who worries about immigration, the guy who does home affairs, the guy who does defence, and he's got all of those strength credentials from those jobs, but he hasn't got much in the way of his credentials as a compassionate leader of people. And so it's trying to leverage his brand strengths in defence and security into also showing that he's a compassionate leader of people. And I thought it did that job with a focus and with a nice execution. So I thought it was a good ad. You might remember, if you think about the last federal election, I thought the Liberals had a really good launch ad there for Morrison as well.
Yeah.
So they do launch ads well, is my conclusion.
Yeah.
Let's see how it unfolds, though, because the Morrison government might have had a good launch ad, but everything it did thereafter was a disaster. Maybe that'll be... I don't know what happened in the last election campaign, but whoever did their launch ad never got to do another one. Maybe that'll be what happens here. But I thought their launch ad was a very effective communication.
So then we've got an ad that's being run by the Labor Party at this moment. And let's just take a couple of seconds to watch this.
These are all cost of living measures introduced by the federal Labor government because we understand the pressure families are under, and every little bit helps. But look who was opposed to every single one of them. Whichever way you look at it, you'll be worse off under Dutton.
So much shorter and
15 seconds.
Yeah, I know, right? So unskippable. So I'm sure I'm not seeing it on social media, but I live in the city of Melbourne, so I'm not going to be getting this.
I have seen it 1 million times.
Oh, have you really?
I have, yeah.
Huh. Interesting. Well, okay. Yeah, Cooper is apparently a target seat, so that's interesting. It's 15 seconds. It's unskippable YouTube ad, so you have to watch it. It's now when we had John Armitage on the show the other week, we were talking about ads. I don't know if you remember, if you listened to that episode, David, but we were talking about the old pos neg ad as opposed to just doing a straight up neg ad. It had a positive element to it, and then it had a negative element to it. It was obviously addressing the things that Labor has done in terms of trying to address the cost of living, but then saying who's stopping it. What were your takeaways from this particular commercial from the Labor Party?
Yeah, I thought this was an effective effort too. And obviously, completely different product to the one we just talked about with Dutton, and trying to accomplish a completely different task. So this is carpet bombing. At least that's been my personal experience. It's an ad that, as you say, is unskippable. People are obliged to go through the message of it. And it's really just down and dirty, making the point that this guy's a slasher, and he's going to engage in a set of policies which will make your life harder.
Mm.
And that obviously plays to the cost of living chord, which is playing so well at the moment. So I thought effective. I think it's probably run its course now. I haven't seen it for a little while, but a month ago it was everywhere on the internet, and I think it was a bit of a scene setter. It was it's cheap and dirty. Production values are low, very easy to make, and a scene setter for the kind of campaign we're going to see.
So it's just interesting to watch this battle royale between the two messages of the Liberal Party trying to frame up Peter Dutton as a guy with heart and compassion, and then the Labor Party dirtying him up as much as possible to say, this guy, it's kind of like, remember how we just threw certainly in Victoria, and sort of replicated in other state campaigns as well, the Liberal Party insert leader as the cuts guy, and there once again, Labor is trying to pull that maneuver and just saying this person is the obstacle between a better future for Australians, and so therefore you must not vote for this person. And I just wonder how that's going to play out over the course of the campaign, and who's going to win that argument.
Well, I guess we'll see in the budget, and then in the budget reply, two important moments in the opening rounds of this contest. And we're going to see, some in the electronic campaign from Labor, we'll see some stuff that's a little more sophisticated than the example we've shown today, about where the positive messages and propositions are as well.
Yep. I wonder if I know we talked before about Darren Moss's ads in previous campaigns. I actually don't know if this is a Moss ad, but it is interesting. It's a departure from the traditional negative ad, which was normally, grayscale photo, black background, yellow text, and just sort of like, as you would say, a pamphlet on TV. Whereas this one is a little, being Posneg, I just thought it was a little bit more nuanced. Wonder what that means in terms of things to come. Anyway, something to sort of sit with for a while before we get into the campaign proper. I want to talk about the flip side of what's coming out of the government at the moment. In the last month, Anthony Albanese has made some announcements around health, cost of living, and education, sort of Labor's core strengths. The key announcement included a $150 energy bill rebate, a $25 cap on the PBS prescriptions, and a landmark school funding agreement with the states. We've been looking for Labor to get back onto its core messages that appeal to this particular cohort of voters that turn this election. Does this feel more like it? How are you feeling about this foray into policy announcements at this stage?
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's Labor using its position from government to make announcements that play to its strengths. Labor might be a little disappointed about for how long these things hold the attention of the media cycle. It doesn't really matter how many zeros an announcement has anymore. It struggles to hold 24 hours. But it is laying down the markers so that Labor can talk about these things again and again and again, over and over, and talk about them in its electronic campaign. The PBS one, I think, is a really interesting example because it plays into Trump mania. And I mean, the United States has always loathed our universal healthcare system. Mm. I remember as a young staffer, I accompanied Premier Brax to a biotech conference in San Francisco. And it was a moment in time when Victoria was working hard to establish itself as a lead destination for biotech investment. And we were competing with Queensland, as I recall, for that distinction. And so we were over there promoting Australia and Melbourne as a destination for the biotech industry. And at one point we had something like a private lunch with about 8 senior US executives from pharma. And like a good staffer, I sat in the background and remained silent, but I did listen. And I always remember how they spoke about our PBS. And they sort of denounced it as a socialist system, much like Canada's. So they've always hated Canada's universal healthcare system too. So this has kind of become, a holy grail in some US circles, policy circles, about the fact that Australia and other parts of the world have locked themselves up in these socialist systems where you can't even choose your own doctor. And this hyperbole, which is quite unique to the United States, that they insist on having a healthcare system that's twice as expensive and half as effective as everybody else's. But they really want to sell their medicines around the world for much more. They want to flog consumers around the world in the same way that they are able to flog their own. And no one's going to cop it. But it does mean the PBS will come under greater pressure, financial pressure. And Australians will be determined to defend it. Every man Jack, one of us will. And so I think that it's a good place to position Labor and the government as the armour plating around our PBS that will defend it in the face of tariff attacks from the United States. And they may very well be coming.
I am just having reflected on both what Dutton is doing now and what Albanese is doing. I'm wondering, are you seeing this intentionality from Albanese in terms of being safe and certain with the announcements they're making versus Dutton, who is pursuing policies that could be seen as controversial? John and I talked about this on the episode the other week, where sometimes you can make policy announcements that are controversial. But even though 60% of the population agree with it, or maybe even more, there's a cohort of the population that hate it and they're loud about it, but they're the minority, and it enables that story to then kick along. So therefore more people find out about it. And I'm just wondering, is there a contrast going on here right now between these two leaders and the announcements they're making? Does that set the scene for how it will play out for the rest of the campaign?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting reflection. I've often discussed this previously with John, trying to find that perfect political issue which is both popular and controversial, and which enables the candidate to stand up and insist that they're a person of courage and principle while they back a popular policy that's got a small minority vociferously attacking it. Dutton hasn't quite been that. I mean, if you think about the nuclear issue, for instance, there they've chosen something that is controversial but is genuinely difficult and opposed by a broad swathe of people, and they're obviously going to persist with it. So Dutton hasn't been quite so discriminating in his choices about that. Now, there was an article a few weeks ago by my friend Christopher Pyne where he pointed out that nuclear policy was essentially an artifice by the Liberal Party to shut down and manage its internal contradictions around coal and climate change, because they could all fight for nuclear even if they couldn't fight for any other kind of energy. And perhaps Christopher Pyne is right, because one of the attributes of the Liberal Party over the last little while has been its unity. So I guess the point about Dutton's policies being bold as a positive adjective, because they are opposed and they're somewhat controversial, might be true, but we've got to see it play out. I don't think his choices so far have been particularly discriminating. I don't think Labor will feel like anything he's doing has ambushed them. His Lowy speech, which I did listen to, was quite orthodox, I thought, notwithstanding his limp-wristed comment. He did engage in some scarifying about the armada off our coast, of one destroyer, one cruiser, and a replenishment vessel. But he knows better than that too. Like he might be beating that up for his political purposes of, I mean, what does he think the Albanese government should have done? Sent a squadron of F-35s into the middle of the Tasman Strait to bomb it? Like, what's he imagining?
Yeah.
Well, of course, he's not imagining anything like that, because the flotilla were doing nothing illegal. And but he, by talking that up, he's obviously trying to talk up issues like defence and security, because he believes they're brand strengths for him, brand strengths for the coalition. But I don't think we've yet seen any policy innovation.
WA, we saw a great result for the party over there earlier in the month.
We really did.
We did. And the GST deal that has been announced shows the WA campaign strategy at work. This is an ongoing GST floor deal favouring WA. It's a smart way of locking in crucial Western Australian seats. It obviously worked for the WA Premier, Roger Cook, in their state election, and Labor's hoping to double down on that at the federal poll. There's a lot of critical battleground seats in Western Australia that we picked up in the last election campaign that we want to hang on to, we need to hang on to. So I just want to get your reflections on that.
Yeah, I thought that was really a stupendous result, and the Western Australian branch should really be very, very proud of themselves. I was expecting them to win, but I was expecting it to be a more traditional election result, after the sort of Ceausescu Romanian result they got last time, where there was, 2 Liberals and a cat versus 800 Labor members.
UN election inspectors were sent into Western Australia after the election just to check that this is legit, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was just stupendous, but a kind of a once in a generation result, once in a century result. But to follow that up with a third election victory, which is still enormous, was a great result, and obviously tremendous result for Roger Cook. And I'll come back to Roger in a moment, but also a tremendous result, I thought, for Anthony Albanese and the federal Labor government, because it shows that the Labor brand is in a strong state in the West, and that the fact that Albo was adjacent to a popular premier at the last election, and the fact that that's going to continue to be the case, I think is a really strong signal that Labor goes into this campaign in very good repair in the West. And as you say, it needs to. And it's always been a concern that we would just lose 1 or 2 seats there, and that would shave us in a way that we can't afford. And I think we can now be quietly optimistic that, there's good reasons to think Labor's Western flank is really strong. And you will remember at the last federal election, when things were at their darkest, and then like the riders of Rohan out of the West came the West Australians, and they elected the Albo government. That's what happened.
Yeah, exactly.
And we shouldn't give up hope that the riders of Rohan are going to come back. I said I was going to come back to Roger Cook. I listened to your episode about Western Australia, and you were extolling the fact that Western Australia was an example of a really smooth handover from one premier to another, and drawing that back to the Victorian state government, which is something you like to do about everything, no matter where it happens. I just wanted to point out to you that Roger Cook's ascension to the job of premier was far more interesting than you made out.
Yes, I know.
And after the shock announcement by the premier that he was leaving, as is the way in all political parties, and certainly the Labor Party, the first thing you do is start plotting to replace the position, and the second thing you do is remember to say something to the person leaving. They immediately started trying to work out who the next premier would be. Roger had every reason to think it was going to be him, but there was this meeting down at the United, I guess what we used to call the MISOs, the United Workers Union, and they anointed someone else to be premier on the basis that their decision would bind their members, and their members would bind the left, and the left had the numbers in the caucus, and this anointed person would sail through the conclave of the State Parliamentary Labor Party and moved directly from her press conference out the front of the Missos to a press conference out the front of the Premier's office. And as history tells us, it didn't go to plan. Everyone was desperately offended that the Missos behaved in this way, and their imperial writ did not run. And the right revolted, the hard left revolted, Roger won the ballot. And I just point this out to say that I think for Roger, that was a brilliant beginning, because for a lot of Western Australian voters who are a crusty bunch and love their resources industry and can be a little susceptible to right-wing messages about mining and resources and environmentalism, for them to have a leader storm the palace and run over the United Workers' Union as he did it, I think was perfect scene setting in the context of Western Australian politics. There you go. There's my comment. I'm sure lots of missos will now write into you, Stephen, and remind you what a dreadful person I am.
I'm sure they will. And that's a good segue into people writing into us for our Social Democratic mailbag. And I just want to plug all of our Patreon subscribers that are able to do that. If you do want to send us a question, then you need to subscribe to our Patreon page. We've got a bunch of questions here, so I'm just going to go through them now. The first one comes from Jason, and he said, while the situation with Canada is different to Australia and there is less white-hot anger and more despair, if the Trump administration threatens the PBS, is there an appetite to withdraw from AUKUS for something less expensive that will arrive quicker from France or Japan? I like how he's linked the PBS to just going straight for AUKUS. David, your thoughts on the question from Jason? Thank you, Jason, for your question.
Yeah, well, I think Jason really hits something on the head there when he says that in Canada they're angry and in Australia there's despair. I really feel that. I don't know if it's the circles I move in, but I think that's true. We saw after the sort of erratic Trump behaviour towards Canada, Canadians really rally around their flag and their leaders, and Trudeau, for the first time in a long time, sounded really strong and assertive and persuasive. And we've talked about Canada, but I thought it was a very interesting moment in Canadian global politics. And I just put this out there. I think Australia's decision to not respond to the tariffs that were placed upon us was a mistake politically. I think Albo could have used that moment to have said something a little more galvanising and a little more assertive about, you can't just walk all over us. In any event, that I've no doubt at all that their decision to not respond with tariffs was the right public policy thing to do. So I'm not questioning their decision. I think, but the government, I can imagine the government deliberating over how it should respond, working out what was best for our economy, what was the smartest way to position ourselves for the more serious threats that are going to come out of the Trump administration down the road. I've got no doubt at all they made the right public policy choice. I'm just not sure that they announced it and declared it in a forceful enough way to galvanise Australians in a way that they could have. Someone said to me about Canada, well, the Canadians could afford to, and the government in Canada could afford to mouth off about Trump because they were being threatened in a way that we weren't being threatened, and Trudeau was finishing up as Prime Minister and they're on the eve of an election. And I thought to myself, well, yes, that's different, but it's not wildly different. We too are on the eve of an election. We too have a leader who's fighting for their political life. This could have been a moment which, to be crude, he could have exploited this for domestic political gain in a way that would not have compromised our diplomatic position. Anyway, I digress from Jason a little bit there. I don't think there's any appetite to move away from AUKUS. And I don't think there's any appetite on either side of politics to move towards other potential solutions, the most attractive of those being, in my judgment, the French, but perhaps also the Japanese. I, I, I'm not aware of anybody on either government or in opposition imagining anything other than AUKUS being the cornerstone of our future. And Jason, I'll just finish that thought by saying I'm not sure that's right, and I'm not sure that's going to be how the story ends, but I think that's where we're at now.
Mm. I agree with your point that it wasn't a missed opportunity. It's just interesting watching how leaders around the world are currently responding to how do you handle Trump, because you've got obviously the Trudeau Canadian experience where they're standing strong and standing firm and Canada first, and then you've got the Kier Starmer version, which is he's going over to the White House and extending invitations by the King to come and do a state visit kind of stuff, and it's just this kind. I just find it fascinating to see how various leaders are dealing with it, and I do think.
But to be fair to Sir Kier, that was at a moment in time when he and Macron were trying to massage Trump into adopting a sensible, forceful position on the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And by the Saturday of that week, that had all been blown to smithereens by Trump's and JD Vance's brutish, crude behaviour.
Yeah.
And at that moment, both of them stood up in a way which I thought was very commendable. And Kier Starmer met very publicly with Zelensky. Zelensky didn't put on a suit for that meeting either. He marched down Downing Street and embraced him before he could even get to the door of number 10, and made quite a display. And then took Zelensky to see the King, who was very keen to see him, to send the same signal. So you're right. People have tried to flatter Trump. They've tried to appeal to his narcissistic self. But when that fails, in the case certainly of Macron and Starmer, they have stood up.
There is a long form article in the New York Times this week, an interview the New York Times did directly with Kier Starmer. It's actually quite an interesting read. Starmer and Trump talk regularly throughout the week.
Yeah, that surprises me.
Yeah, but mostly about his golf courses in Scotland. But nonetheless, they do talk. So Starmer is taking a different approach. Like I agree with you. He did do those public statements. He did greet Zelensky at number 10. But I do also think he's doing a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes to keep that dialogue open with Trump in ways that others aren't. So but I agree to your original point. I think that I think Albanese missed a chance there to say, hey, don't be, we've got a unique relationship, but you've got interest in our country and we have interest in your country, and they.
Yeah, we've got some things too. We've got stuff you want to keep doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jason, for the question. Okay, next question it comes from Malcolm. And Malcolm asks, around the time of the recent Queensland election, David commented very briefly on the Queensland Labor Party's campaign machinery and capabilities. The implication was that it was not up to scratch, or at least questions should be asked. And Malcolm asks, what has become of the Queensland 2024 campaign review? We can all see that Labor holds only 5 of the 30 Queensland federal seats, having lost one in 2022 and also a Senate seat lost in 2019. Polling indicates little change. Rather than air dirty laundry, perhaps David and Stephen might comment on what a better campaign machine might look like for the Queensland politic. Thank you, Malcolm, for your question. Do you want to touch that one, David? I don't recall you doing that, to be fair. I know that when we did the...
No, I did. Malcolm is quite right. Yeah.
You've got a better memory than I do.
Yeah. Malcolm is right to accuse me of this. I don't hold them in high regard. I don't know what's become of the 2024 campaign review, Malcolm, but we can be confident that they're not going to let me within light years of it. I don't know what, my capacity to influence and shape these events was ended many years ago. And I don't know what the future holds. I think what the campaign machine in Queensland needs is just a radical reset about its tactics and procedures. And I worry that it's just a little bit antiquated and obsolete. And I think the particular moment that Malcolm is calling me out for is when I suggested that in the Queensland state election, there seemed to be results that came as a complete surprise to the Labor campaign. And that didn't speak to their capacity to, have a domain awareness about what was going on across their seats. So a seat like Rockhampton, there were seats that were long-held Labor strongholds that suddenly slipped away, and they seemed astonished, as astonished as everybody else that it had happened. That in the federal campaign, my sources here are erratic and contradictory, so I'm even less certain of what I'm saying here than I usually am. But I seem to remember that people were surprised at the result in Griffith, and that they thought Labor's position had collapsed there far faster and harder than they were expecting. So all of that speaks to my concern that the campaign apparatus in Queensland, doesn't have a good radar, and part of that is a good ground campaign. And I think they've been able to get away with it for years and years and years because the Tories up there don't either. Mm-hmm. And, if all of your political adversaries are in the Jurassic period, then you don't stand out as a dinosaur. But I think, our results there are so bad that we need to do something really dramatic.
As I
understand it for this upcoming federal campaign, we've got sort of a bit of a hope with respect to Griffith, and hoping that the Green candidate, Sir Buffton Tufton, might be in trouble. And there's a bit of a hope that Labor can come out on top in a three-cornered contest in Brisbane. And we're expecting the Liberals to reclaim Ryan. So the Greens are kind of up against it, or have got serious contests in all three of their suburban seats. Great. But where's Labor winning seats? What's happening in Leichhardt? What's happening in Ford? Yeah.
I do think that if I can push back slightly on the analysis of the state campaign and state operation there, I think broadly speaking, they've run a pretty good show. I do think they knew where they were going to have opportunities to hold seats at the last state election, and they doubled down on that. They do run a ground campaign, certainly, and this has been happening everywhere, so it's not just a Queensland thing, but, I'm wondering if we need to review how early we put in our resources to build that field program. I think nationally now we're probably doing it a little bit too late, but that's a whole other topic. The thing that I can't square is how is it that we historically are so successful at a state level in Queensland and yet are abysmal at a federal level? That's the bit I just can never seem to get an answer on when I talk to Queenslanders. And it's the different responses are, well, we don't really run the campaign at a federal level. We don't have control over the messaging and how we want to message that to our people in Queensland at a federal level, as opposed to the actual control that we do have over our campaign. Queenslanders will only elect a Queensland leader. It's the only time we had a great.
That's a position, in my experience, usually advanced by Queensland MPs.
Yeah. So
make me leader, and I'll deliver you a victory.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a whole bunch of different things that are thrown up, and I still haven't kind of worked it out. But anyway, that's probably for another podcast. We will do some.
It's a more regional state. It's a whiter state. It's a more culturally homogenous state. That only makes it a few degrees different to everybody else, and certainly makes it similar to terrain we've all got in the other states. So it's not an alien country.
No, and the Queenslanders do I've had folks on the show before, like we did 4 or 5 episodes leading up to the Queensland campaign, and what you've just said then is what they say to me, and I don't always completely agree with them, but anyway. Last question. How are we going for time? This is a monster episode here. Last question is from Jake. I feel that Anthony Albanese needs to go on social media, for example, and do Friendly Geordies or other sort of YouTube channels, even more apolitical stuff, and talk about Labor Party policies and even more about his own personal life. And he's mentioned, growing up in a single mother home and his love for the South Sydney Rabbitohs. And voters, basically what Jake is asking here, it's a long question. Voters want a real person, and a genuine example of that was Andrews Malinauskas Palaszczuk. The problem with the Harris campaign was that she played it too safe and sounded like a career politician, not genuine. So the question is, how do we make the Labor Party populist without going down the road of racism and discrimination-based messaging? And how do we win over the progressive base and a social conservative base? Geez, Jake, you're not asking for much there. Thank you, though, Jake, for your question. David, thoughts on
that? Well, the short answer is he's right. Jake's right. What I liked, his question mentions Friendly Geordies, and I think give them a shout out. I love Friendly Geordies. I think he's right, and I think Albo knows it. So we have talked about the fact that one of the features of the last election in the United States was the sort of rapid expansion of influence in the sort of podcast online ecosystem, and the fact that there was a galaxy of prominent conservative commentators and channels for that message, and that we needed to be on top of that phenomena here in a way that the Democrats obviously weren't, but that no one had been. I recently saw some statistics which I thought were really interesting, of looking at all of the various podcast channels in the United States and whether they're right or left. And the right-wing ones, and if you categorise Joe Rogan as right-wing, which is probably something you could tentatively do, they're a million years ahead. So we kind of always imagine the online ecosystem as having a left tilt. That's clearly not the case in the United States of America. And that worked well for Trump, because all of these different channels in their own constituencies can propagate messages, can reinforce one another, and can give leaders long-form interviews which help galvanise the base. All of that was seen by Albo and by the National Secretariat of the Labor Party, and they're onto it. So I think one of the features is that, so Albo has done some podcasts in recent times, and I'm sure he's out there hunting to do more. I think he's comfortable in the long form style, as the questioner says. He's got the log cabin story, and we all want to hear that again. But once we're sick of it, others are only just starting to hear it. That's a format and a style of conversation that I think suits him, and he wants to do it, and he's doing it, and he clearly wants to do more. And I think I've seen no sign of Dutton or the Liberals being onto this in the same way.
I wonder if there's a centre-left political podcast out there that is keenly listened to by the Labor and broader progressive left out there, that Anthony Albanese could go on and actually chat to people and energise the base. I wonder if there's a podcast out there that he could go and sit down for an hour, maybe, I don't know, come down to Melbourne and come to the Dunn Street studios and sit on the beautiful mid-century armchair that I have there that three-time winning election Premier Daniel Andrews has done as well, and to have a chat to the listeners about,
You should definitely be putting in a request, yes.
I wonder if he has ever thought about doing that. Anyway, Jake, thank you so much for your question, and thanks to everyone, all of our Patreon listeners have sent in your questions this week for David. We're almost at the end, but we need to wrap up with our traditional segment that goes for 5 hours, which is called Strategos and Tacitus, which is when we examine what's going on overseas. We've touched a little bit about overseas, but we do have a question, David, for you, which is also from Jason. I'd love to hear David's thoughts on where the Middle East now sits a few months into the Trump presidency. So here's an opportunity, David, for you just to give us a bit of a...
All right, buckle up, everybody.
Okay, I'll be back. I'm just going to make a cup of tea, and I'll be back in about 35 minutes.
So if we start with the fall of the Ottoman Empire... All right, I'll restrain myself. Well, I think one of the interesting things about 2025 as compared to 2024 is the fact that Trump squats in the middle of our media cycle like a bloated entity and forces out so much else. And, that Trump is calling this flood the zone. So he's doing so many things of consequence domestically and internationally. And everyone is so obsessed by him that he is firmly in the middle of everything. And other conversations and other happenings, which were once accorded at least some coverage, sort of fading to black as Trump absorbs the whole spotlight for himself. And so we're thinking about that, isn't it interesting how the war in Gaza has slowly but inexorably retreated in our in its coverage and in our imagination as the days and months have gone by. It kind of splutters forth from time to time. I recall there was a bit of coverage when the Hamas terrorists returned the bodies of those two babies that they'd strangled. So from time to time it splutters back into life, but the issue really has fallen into abeyance as compared to 2024.
Can't find it on the New York Times at the moment. I know it sounds like this is the only thing I read, but like literally the algorithm, and it knows what I want to read. And I know that there was a new offensive that had sort of opened up over the last week. I couldn't find any articles. I had to go searching for it.
Yeah,
because it's just all Trump crazy stuff right now.
And in Syria, we've now got the new regime being accused of conducting genocidal attacks on its Christian and Alawite minorities, and you can barely read anything about that. So, and of course, this isn't just true of the Middle East, it's true of every corner of the globe, that Trump is just, like a black hole sucking all oxygen into his own vortex, and so many other issues are forgotten. So what that means, I guess, is that all of these other international issues, as they fade, become less influential in Australian public life.
Well, I'm sure it'll change again, because I mean, last time we did this episode, we talked about what was going on in the Ukraine, and literally after we'd finished recording, we had the most bizarrest moment of the year, which was the Zelensky meeting in the White House, and I messaged you saying, wow.
Yeah, that once again, I was an oracle. You're denouncing Trump 24 hours before he just behaved so badly. And JD Vance, who I might have been, might have thought was, anyway, I just thought his behaviour in that meeting.
What a prick. What a prick.
I wouldn't give him the time of day ever again.
If you're Zelensky sitting in that meeting and you're just going, what are you doing?
This heroic leader of a country that's been under such dreadful threat, being berated by someone who had bone spurs during the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Like, fuck off.
Oh, I was livid. Yeah. I really felt for Zelensky.
I was just sickened. I was kind of, to early questioner's point, I was in despair.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing of it is, it's his third language as well. Like, there was moments there where, I know,
like, Trump struggles with the one.
Yeah, exactly. Zelensky should have started speaking Ukrainian to his staff and looking at what are we doing here? Like, what is the point of this? But it was a no-win situation. It was just so bad. All of it was so bad. I just don't even know if you...
It did reassure me, though, on one level, Stephen, and that is that if Australia ever does face a serious military threat, I'm confident that America will come to our assistance. It'll just cost us half of our iron ore.
Yeah.
It's a different world.
Yeah, it really is. Anyway. Well, and we'll come back again in a month's time, and it'll all change again.
Maybe.
Unless there is an election called, in which we will kick off our weekly election recap. So maybe you'll be back, David, sooner than you wish. Thank you so much again, comrade, for coming on the show. Really appreciate your insights for another month of the Feeney Files.
My pleasure. Can I just finish with one small little... we lost a great hero of the Labor Party this week, and someone who I care for very much. That's David Cragg. David Cragg is a veteran of the Melbourne University Labor Club, and I first met him when I was at the Melbourne Uni Labor Club and seeking out some of our earlier heroes. He worked for Robert Ray for a long time as an advisor and speechwriter, and then went to work for the Federated Iron Workers Association, which became the AWU. It was a great drinking companion, a very thoughtful, caring man, and he will be greatly missed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you mentioned that, David, because I have thought about David this week. Such a compassionate and calm person. Remember, he used to be the returning officer for the Melbourne FEA, and there would be like disputes over ballots and fake IDs and people ready to, throw down arms. And David would just be this calming person sitting at the table. Well, comrade, we're gonna envelope this ballot paper, and I'm sure we can sort it out later. He's just a soothing person and such a great stalwart. I mean, there's going to be so many wonderful things said about the man, but unbelievable.
And he was kind of the ideological commissar of the right, wasn't he? He was kind of our historian and our ideologue. I remember one of the things he did when I was a young, very, very young activist was he enrolled me as an FIA delegate to Trades Hall, the Workers' Parliament. And one of the, I remember walking in and the Stormont and Packers yelling, "Grouper, Grouper," at David and I, because they were not necessarily appreciative of our more forthright Labor unity position. But he always had the history and the intellectual arguments to justify our socially democratic position.
He did. Didn't he refer to the NCC as the Northcote Civic Council, or what was his?
Well, that was an older tradition that he continued. Yes, of referring to the Northcote City Council, because he didn't want to say National Civic Council within earshot of anyone else in the Labor Party for fear of being expelled.
Yeah.
No one these days even knows what the NCC is, Stephen.
No, I know. I just thought that actually, as I said that out aloud, as the words left my breath. There is a memorial.
Good evening. How do you do?
Yeah. And thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up. There's a memorial to celebrate the life of David Cragg at the Victorian Trades Hall Council on Thursday.
Thursday, that's correct.
At 2:30 to 4:30. So if you want to pay some respects to a great Labor person, then please go down to the Trades Hall and celebrate the life of a great man. Thanks, Dave, for appreciating. I bring that up. I really do appreciate that. On that note, have a great month, and we'll talk to you soon.
See you, mate.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Socially Democratic. Like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser, and get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic by following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. See you next Friday.